Here's something that will stop you cold. The Holocaust was not caused by a single madman with a bad mustache. According to an author writing under the name An Unknown Soldier, the Holocaust was the inevitable end result of a chain reaction that started with a Muslim mathematician praying in 940 AD. Today, we're unpacking that argument, specifically what epiphanic thresholds are and why they keep ending in catastrophe, how one invention, the optical lens, set the entire modern world in motion, and why the author argues that the real villain isn't a Nazi, it's academia. By the end of this episode, you'll have a completely different framework for understanding how knowledge itself can become dangerous. And the person I want to dig into this with is someone who has gone deep on this material, so walk me in. Where does this story actually begin?
It begins in the year 940 AD with a man named Ibn Sahl. And the author is very deliberate about this. He opens by saying, and I'm quoting directly here, "Few know this, but the 20th century began in the year 940 AD, when the Muslim scholar and mathematician Ibn Sahl was born."
Okay, so right away, that's a provocation. The 20th century began in 940 AD.
Right, and the author anticipates the skepticism. He literally writes, "Anyone in the audience who concludes I am waxing rhetorical again is in for a rough ride." So he knows how it sounds. But his argument is that Ibn Sahl became, and again, I'm quoting, "the first person in history to quantify a theory of optics, not to invent the lens, to codify the mathematics of how light bends. And that distinction matters enormously."
What's the distinction? Like, why does the math matter more than the physical object?
Because the math is what made everything reproducible and improvable. The author notes that crude lenses, crystals, glass spheres were used by many cultures before Ibn Sahl, but everything, quote, came into crisp focus because of Ibn Sahl. His algorithm is what allowed the telescope, the microscope, the camera, X-rays, all of it to eventually exist. Without the math, you just have a pretty crystal.
So he's the foundation. Everything else is built on his work.
Exactly. And the author makes this point in a way that's almost dizzying. He writes, "Imagine the 20th century without telescopes or microscopes or cameras. Just try. I dare you. No modern astronomy, no modern physics, no photography, no television, no film." And then he lands this line, "No lens means no Star Trek," which is funny, but it's also making a serious point.
Ha, no Star Trek. Okay, I feel that.
But here's where it gets genuinely moving. The author describes Ibn Sahl not just as a scientist, but as, quote, "a disciple of God." He writes that when Ibn Sahl was not investigating the properties of light, he was in daily prayer searching for answers that eluded him in his work. He draws a direct parallel to Albert Einstein. Both men, the author says, were dedicated to seeking the truth of God in the most powerful and relevant force in creation, energy.
That's a beautiful framing. Science and faith as the same search.
And it sets up the central tragedy of the whole series, because the author's argument is that the divorce between science and faith, which eventually becomes total and catastrophic, is not inevitable. It's a failure of human beings to hold both things at once.
Okay, but before we get to the divorce, I want to understand why Ibn Sahl was obscure. Because if he's this foundational, why don't we all know his name?
This is where the author goes somewhere unexpected. He argues that Ibn Sahl was born into obscurity not because of anything internal to the Islamic world. In fact, he's very clear that Arabia at the time was experiencing what he calls the Islamic Renaissance, a period of relative peace and undeniable prosperity. Ibn Sahl was obscure because of Caesar.
Caesar, as in Julius Caesar. That's Caesar.
That's Caesar. And the author does not mince words here. He writes, "I am perplexed why any scholar today venerates Caesar as a civilizing agent. He calls Caesar's system, quote, apartheid. Specifically, he argues that Caesar implemented a system of control on the premise of earned citizenship. You serve in the legions for 15 years, you get rights. If you don't, you have no rights whatsoever, not even to travel."
So the Roman Empire reframed as an apartheid state.
Exactly. And the author says this apartheid covered half of Europe, parts of Arabia, and nearly all of northern Africa. The kingdoms of Arabia were suffering its lasting effects just as much as the kingdoms of Europe. Arabia just recovered faster because of its proximity to India, which is how Ibn Sahl had access to the optical knowledge he then codified mathematically.
So Caesar's legacy of control is actually what relayed the spread of Ibn Sahl's work to Europe.
That's the implication. And there's something almost poetic about it. The author notes that the telescope was an invention the Crusaders brought back with them from the Crusades. So the very wars that were supposed to be about religious conquest ended up being the delivery mechanism for the Islamic Renaissance's greatest scientific contribution.
That is wild. The Crusaders accidentally imported the scientific revolution.
Which is exactly the kind of irony the author loves. And it sets up his broader framework, which he calls epiphanic thresholds. The idea is that every time humanity gains paradigm-shifting knowledge, there is a period of cognitive dissonance among the intelligentsia, and that dissonance results in social upheaval and human rights violations. Every single time.
Okay, so define that for me. What is an epiphanic threshold in practice?
Think of it as the moment when new knowledge fundamentally contradicts the existing worldview, and the people whose identity is built on that worldview cannot accept the new truth. The author identifies 13 of these thresholds in the series, each one prefacing the next, and he describes it as, quote, a ratcheting mechanism. The consequences of each epiphany grow worse.
A ratchet. So it only goes one direction.
Only one direction. And the chain he traces is breathtaking in its scope. From Ibn Sahl's lens, you get the telescope. Through Galileo's telescope, humanity comes, in his words, unhinged. Then, almost immediately, Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope opens the microcosm. Then Malthus, then Darwin, then Pasteur, each one tumbling into the rabbit hole opened by Ibn Sahl's lens.
And each one widening the gap between science and religion.
Widening it until it becomes a chasm. The author marks a very specific moment as the point of no return, 1905. He writes that in 1905, with the proof that diseases were not punishments from God, but the biological consequences of pathogens, quote, the divorce between religion and science became final. And then he says something stark. At this juncture, there was no way to stop the Holocaust.
Wow, that's a heavy line.
It is. And it's worth sitting with, because he's not saying Pasteur caused the Holocaust. He's saying that once science completely displaced religion as the framework for understanding reality, the conditions were set. Because from 1905 forward, as he puts it, science would reign supreme among the world's intelligentsia. But, and this is the critical but, the few who were following empirical method were outpaced by those who published pseudoscience in what he calls an orgy of intellectual ambition.
So it's not science that's the problem. It's bad science dressed up as science.
Precisely. And this is where the author's diagnosis gets really sharp. He argues that the consistent failure of accredited academia to maintain the integrity of peer review is what allowed hypothesis to be presented to the general public as settled science. That's the mechanism. That's how you get from a microscope to a Holocaust.
Okay, I want to push on that because it feels like a big leap. How does bad peer review lead to mass murder?
Through the scene the author sets in 1910. He takes us to Café Central in Vienna, and this is one of the most vivid passages in the whole piece. He writes that in a thick cloud of opium smoke, a clique of chin-scratchers evolved into what he calls the proletariat, the first and only species of hominid in history to be defined by science. Except, he says, it wasn't science. It was insanity.
And who's in this cafe?
Alfred Adler, Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin, Dmitry Mitrinovich, and Vladimir Lenin in absentia. The author says they were planning a global war of extinction. The revolution, it was agreed, had to be, quote, sudden, violent, and catalytic. The goal was to eliminate the world's royalty, nobility, aristocracy, and bourgeoisie in one fell swoop. And their plan, the author notes with devastating irony, was extremely scientific.
Extremely scientific. That's chilling.
And then the author adds one more figure. He writes, on the periphery of this coffee clutch was a loner named Adolf, soaking it all in from a table across the room, and he began making plans of his own.
So Hitler is literally sitting in the corner of this cafe, listening to the architects of the Soviet Revolution plan their global war.
That's the image the author paints. And then he closes it with this line, all of this from the consequences of Ibn Sahl's lens. It's a full circle moment that lands like a gut punch.
I mean, it's an extraordinary claim, but the chain of logic is actually there when you follow it step by step.
That's what makes the argument so compelling and so unsettling. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's a causal chain. Each link is historically grounded. The author is just willing to follow the chain all the way back to its origin in a way that most historians aren't.
And the origin is a man in prayer trying to understand light.
A man in prayer trying to understand light, who, by the way, the author says should have been known the world over, but was born into obscurity because of Caesar's apartheid. There's a real grief in how the author writes about Ibn Sahl. He calls him the most significant scientific mind to ever have lived, and then notes that most people have never heard his name.
That's actually heartbreaking. The person who arguably set the modern world in motion is basically unknown.
And the author connects that obscurity directly to Caesar's legacy. He writes that the rehabilitation of Caesarian apartheid has been complete. Today it's called the Roman Empire instead of what it actually was, which is a form of the same idolatry he diagnoses throughout the whole piece.
Okay, let's talk about that diagnosis. Because idolatry is a word with a lot of religious baggage. What does the author actually mean by it?
He defines it very carefully, and it's one of the most interesting parts of the whole piece. He writes, when theologians are more devoted to their interpretations of Scripture than they are to manifest truth, that is a form of idolatry. When scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than manifest truth, that is a form of idolatry. So he's using the word in a purely functional sense. It's about what you're actually worshiping, whether that's a text or a theory.
So scientific idolatry is just being too attached to your own hypothesis.
Exactly. And then he says something that I think is the most universally applicable line in the whole piece. Since everyone is, in some measure, both theologian and scientist, we are all susceptible to idolatry. We believe what we believe for reasons we are convinced are justifiable. When those justifications are exposed as fallacies, we are hard-pressed to abandon our beliefs because we define ourselves, too much, I conclude, by what we believe.
We define ourselves by what we believe. That's the core of it.
That's the core of it. And he argues that what every major religion instructs and what peer review in science enforces is the same thing, that we are our own worst counsel. Accepting that, he says, is the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual to overcome. But it must be done.
There's something almost paradoxical about that. The free-thinking individual has to accept that their own thinking is the problem.
Right. And that's exactly the kind of cognitive dissonance the author is describing at every epiphanic threshold. The people who could not accept Galileo's telescope weren't stupid. They were deeply invested in a worldview that the telescope was dismantling. The people who could not accept germ theory weren't stupid either. They were invested in a moral framework where disease was divine judgment. The investment is the problem, not the intelligence.
And the investment only grows with each threshold, which is why the ratchet only goes one direction.
Exactly. Each epiphany raises the stakes. By the time you get to 1910 and the men in Café Central, the investment is total. They have built an entire political philosophy on what they believe is science. And when your political philosophy is scientific, any opposition to it is not just wrong, it's subhuman. That's how you get to genocide.
That's a really clarifying way to put it. The scientization of politics is what makes political violence feel justified.
And the author is careful to say this is not an argument against science. He writes explicitly, "Do not mistake me for blaming the Holocaust on Ibn Sahl. That was entirely science's doing." Meaning the failure of science, the failure of peer review, the failure of intellectual honesty, not science itself. Ibn Sahl's work, he says, invited as many blessings as it did curses.
So the lens is neutral. It's what we do with the knowledge that determines whether it's a blessing or a curse.
That's the author's position. And he makes it concrete with one of the most sobering facts in the piece. He notes that antibiotics were only first used in human beings to treat infections on D-Day hospital ships in 1944. Before that, the majority of deaths were due to infection. So the same chain of discovery that eventually led to the Holocaust also led to the thing that saved the most lives in human history.
Wait, antibiotics only first used on humans in 1944? That's incredible and terrifying.
It really is. And it's the kind of detail that reframes everything. We think of the 20th century as this era of unprecedented horror, and it was. But it was also the era when humanity finally figured out how to stop dying from a cut on your hand. Both things came from the same chain of discovery. The author's point is that we have to be honest about both.
And being honest about both requires exactly the kind of intellectual humility he's describing, the willingness to say, this thing I believe might be wrong.
Which is, of course, the hardest thing for any human being to do, especially when your identity is built on that belief. The author doesn't offer an easy solution. He just says that recognizing the pattern, recognizing our reflex to catastrophize at the edge of accepted knowledge, may be the only way to avert the next Holocaust.
The next Holocaust. He uses that phrase deliberately.
Very deliberately. The series is called March to the Holocaust, and he closes this opening piece by saying the next podcast series will be called the Substancia Nigra, documenting what he calls the socialist outrages of the 20th century. So this is not a retrospective, it's a warning.
A warning written by someone who won't even put their name on it.
An unknown soldier, which is itself a statement. The author is positioning themselves as someone who has no stake in the outcome, no reputation to protect, no hypothesis to defend, just the argument itself, standing on its own.
Which is, in a way, the opposite of the idolatry they're diagnosing.
Exactly. And I think that's intentional. The author is modeling the very intellectual posture they're arguing for, anonymity as a form of epistemic humility. You can't be attached to a hypothesis if you're not attached to your own name.
That's a genuinely interesting move. I hadn't thought about the anonymity that way.
It reframes the whole thing. And it also means the argument has to stand entirely on its own merits. There's no authority to appeal to, no credentials to hide behind, just the chain of logic, from Ibn Sahl's prayer to the opium smoke of Café Central.
Let me ask you something that I think a lot of listeners might be sitting with. Is this argument too neat? Like, does tracing everything back to one invention in 940 AD risk oversimplifying something genuinely complex?
That's a fair challenge, and I think the author would welcome it. He's not saying Ibn Sahl caused the Holocaust. He's saying the lens is a useful thread to follow because it's traceable. He writes that rather than attempt a comprehensive study, he charts human history from a single invention to demonstrate how one discovery after another defined the inevitable march. It's a pedagogical choice, not a reductive one.
So the lens is a lens, literally and figuratively, a way of focusing the argument.
Yes. And it's a thread that actually holds. Because the author isn't claiming that nothing else mattered. He's claiming that this particular thread, followed carefully, reveals a pattern that other approaches miss. The pattern of cognitive dissonance at epiphanic thresholds. That pattern is the real subject.
And the pattern is what's actionable. Because if you can see the pattern, you can potentially interrupt it.
That's the hope the author holds out. He writes, perhaps, just perhaps, if we can recognize our flawed reflex to catastrophize at the edge of accepted knowledge, we may avert the next Holocaust. It's a conditional hope, not optimism exactly, more like a challenge.
A challenge issued by an unknown soldier.
Who is, in their own way, standing at an epiphanic threshold right now. Because the argument they're making, that academia's failure of peer review is the root cause of the 20th century's worst atrocities, is itself a paradigm-shifting claim. And the question is whether the people who read it can hold it without catastrophizing.
So when you step back from everything we've covered today, here's what this really comes down to. One mathematician's prayer in 940 AD set off a chain of discoveries that gave humanity its greatest tools and its worst nightmares simultaneously. The telescope, the microscope, germ theory, modern medicine, and also the intellectual conditions for genocide. The author's argument is that the difference between the blessing and the curse was never the knowledge itself. It was whether the people receiving that knowledge could hold it honestly without making it an idol.
And the author gives us a very specific, very human image of what happens when they can't. A cafe in Vienna in 1910. Opium smoke. Men who are absolutely certain that science has given them the right to redesign humanity. And a loner at a corner table taking notes. That image should haunt us because the conditions that produced it, pseudoscience presented as settled truth, peer review abandoned in favor of intellectual ambition, identity fused with ideology, those conditions are not historical. They're structural. They recur.
And the only structural defense against them is the thing the author says is the hardest thing for any free-thinking person to accept, that we are our own worst counsel.
Which is why the author writes anonymously, which is why they call themselves an unknown soldier. The argument has to be bigger than the person making it. That's the model. That's what intellectual humility actually looks like in practice.
Here's what I want to leave you with. Ibn Sahl was in daily prayer when he wasn't investigating the properties of light. He was searching for answers that eluded him in his work. He was, by the author's account, the most significant scientific mind to ever have lived, and most of us have never heard his name. The men in Café Central in 1910 were also certain they were searching for truth. The difference is that one of them was following the light, and the others had decided they already owned it. The next time you encounter a piece of knowledge that feels like it's dismantling something you believe, and you will, because that's what knowledge does, the question the unknown soldier is asking you is, are you following the light, or are you trying to own it?